Welcome, everyone. This is Carmen Yetzi-Mazzara from APSIA. I'm delighted to welcome you to our presentation on mental health and IR career development in this weird age of COVID-19. This session takes the place of some opportunities for us to be together in person, but I'm very glad to have Elise Goss-Alexander from the AU School of International Service here to share her wisdom with us through whatever means we need. As we go through the presentation, which is being recorded, I'm going to ask you to do what Elizabeth has just done and share any questions that you have in the chat box as we go through. If you have any technical issues, you can feel free to ping me directly. And so again, as we go through, please feel free to put your questions in and we'll take them all at the end. I believe to get started, Elise had a survey that she would like us to do. Is that correct, Elise? Mm-hmm. All right. So we're gonna see what 3 adjectives describe how you're feeling about discussing mental health today. So you all can put your answers in there. We'll give you just a minute. Lots of feelings for talking about feelings, which is great. Just a little bit longer to weigh in, and then we'll see how the results look. All right, welcome to those who are just joining us. We're doing a very quick survey to gather your sense of how you're feeling about discussing these issues today. And I'm going to close it out. So any last minute quick typing you'd like to do, now's a great time. Get all of that emotion out and feelings in, and we'll see. Okay. Looks like folks are ready to share. All right, I'm going to close it out. It's okay if you don't get everything in there. There we go. So you should be able to see the results on your screen. Are they visible?
I'm just seeing the percentage of people who voted. So maybe, Carmen, if you can give us a brief overview.
Sure. Actually, are there folks who would like to share what they said in the chat box? As I'm unfortunately not seeing the results either. People are seeing that it's essential, they're encouraged by it, they're feeling comfortable, they feel how timely this is. All sorts of important words to shape our conversation today. So thank you all for that. And exhausting. So hopefully we can make this not exhausting, but yet still very hopeful and useful. So with that, I'm going to turn the floor over to Elise, and I look forward to seeing and hearing your questions afterwards. Thanks everybody for joining us.
Great. Thank you, Carmen. And thanks for all your tech support as we figured out some of the features of this new platform. So I want to start today at the very beginning, the question being, what is mental health? The APA, the American Psychiatric Association, tells us that mental health involves effective functioning in daily activities like work, school, relationships, as well as the ability to adapt to change and cope with adversity. Mental illness, on the other hand, refers to diagnosable mental disorders, which impact thinking, emotion, behavior, and create problems functioning in some of the ways that we just mentioned. It's important to note that these two are not binary. Instead, we can think of mental health as a spectrum along which we all move day to day, depending on a variety of different factors, just like with our physical health. The second base question that I want us to start with is why we as career professionals should care about mental health. Some of you on the call may have a background on this subject already, or you may be licensed counselors yourselves, but I am not a counselor, I am not a therapist, and many of us in this field don't have that training or that background. So if we are career professionals, why should we concern ourselves with mental health? So first of all, everyone has mental health, just like everyone has physical health. We all have a body, and we also all have a brain. We may be stressed one day and thriving the next, but we still have mental health throughout. Second, every single office at your institution interacts with people with mental health issues. Students with mental illnesses or other challenges to their mental health don't interact only with the counseling center or the health center. They also usually live in dorms, they eat in dining halls, they join clubs, and yes, they seek career advising. And mental health extends beyond just moments of diagnosis or crisis. Sometimes mental health conversations focus only on these two times, but mental health issues affect every single part of a student's life, not just those moments of diagnosis or crisis. Just like a student with diabetes still has diabetes even when their blood sugar is perfectly balanced. And finally, this is an important topic for us, especially as career professionals, because career development overlaps not only with basic needs like income and housing, but also questions like purpose and identity, which are key to mental health. Okay, so what we're going to cover today is some quick background information on the intersections of these three big topics: mental health, higher education, and COVID-19. Then we're going to delve specifically into the impact that mental health may have on career development. Then the opposite, the ways that career development may impact mental health. And then finally, we're going to wrap up with some strategies and resources that you can draw on for working with all of our students and helping them to maintain a high level of mental well-being. Okay, so as we start thinking about the background for these issues, I wanted to bring in some statistics and some studies to give us a framework. So the number of students experiencing mental health issues or diagnosed mental illnesses varies from one campus to another, but one study from the World Health Organization of first-year college students in 8 different countries showed that about a third of students surveyed met the criteria for a common lifetime disorder or a 12-month disorder. And you can definitely and should definitely seek more precise numbers from your own campus counseling center. But for now, we can work with this assumption that roughly a quarter to a third of the students at your university may now or have previously met these criteria. The most common disorders reported in this study and in most studies were major depression and generalized anxiety. And this is largely true across most student populations. So I think it's worth pausing here to make sure we're familiar with both of these. There we go. Okay, so clinical depression or major depressive disorder is a very common but also very serious mood disorder involving severe symptoms that affect how you feel, how you think, and how you handle daily activities. These severe symptoms must last at least 2 weeks, and possible symptoms include not only persistent feelings of sadness, hopelessness, or worthlessness, but could also include fatigue, irritability, restlessness, difficulty concentrating, and shifts in sleep cycles. As we walk through these possible symptoms and those for anxiety, you may already be seeing some overlap with the discussions of COVID-19 and its impact on all of us. Go. Okay. And the other most common disorder that comes up is generalized anxiety disorder. This is another common serious illness in which people experience excessive anxiety or worry most days for at least 6 months. Possible symptoms here can include restlessness, fatigue, difficulty concentrating, irritability, difficulty controlling their worries, and again, sleep problems. Again, this is not just worry or concern that is reasonable, although certainly the two interact. Now let's add COVID-19 into the mix. Active Minds, which is a student organization focusing on countering stigma on mental health issues, They produced a report in April 2020 based on a survey that showed that 1 in 5, or 20% of students, say that their mental health significantly worsened under COVID-19, and 80% of college students say that it has negatively impacted their mental health overall. The biggest areas for this impact are stress or anxiety, disappointment or sadness, relocation, loneliness or isolation, and financial setbacks. As we go through this list, some career light bulbs may be going off for you, not only about anxiety and isolation, but also these issues like relocation and financial concerns. I also want to note here it's especially important that some student populations are particularly vulnerable to mental health challenges, and that COVID-19 has only exacerbated these trends. So if we start by thinking about international student mental health, one 2010 study of international graduate students found that 44%, which is close to and possibly higher than overall levels, reported emotional or stress-related problems had significantly affected their well-being or academic performance in the past year. However, for reasons including cultural differences and approaches to mental health, international graduate students were much less likely to make use of mental health services on campus. And now, with the impact of COVID-19, international students face additional stressors due to visa uncertainties and flight restrictions, additional financial difficulties and distance from their support networks, and finally, their ineligibility for many of the financial aid options that are available to other students. A recent study conducted by IIE showed that institutions who responded to a survey estimated 16% of their international student body will not be able to come to campus in person in fall 2020, even if classes resume in person. Similarly, a 2018 study from Rutgers Tyler Clementi Center for Diversity Education and Bias Prevention found that queer spectrum students were 3 to 4 times more likely to report a psychological disorder or report feeling depressed. I want to be clear to say that this is not because LGBTQ students are inherently more given to mental health issues, but rather that the environment of discrimination many of them face in the community and even on campus is not conducive to mental health thriving. And now we also have research increasingly showing that LGBTQ students face mental health challenges in leaving the campuses where they may have been able to explore their sexual or gender identities in a supportive environment and are relocating as campuses closed. The Trevor Project's 2019 survey of LGBTQ youth mental health shows that LGBTQ youth are much more likely to disclose their sexual orientation or gender identity to friends, regardless of their friends' sexual orientation or gender identity, supporting the point that losing campus support and campus community may be a major stressor for many of our students. LGBTQ youth also statistically face higher rates of homelessness and higher rates of involvement in precarious employment or employment in essential businesses, which increases their health risks in this time, and so also their mental health risks. And finally, if we look at this pattern of unequal mental health experiences, it's also clear when we examine statistics for college students by race and ethnicity. One study of 26 campuses nationwide found that white students report the lowest levels of depression and anxiety, and students of color face challenges, especially at predominantly white institutions, including discrimination, lack of community, and lack of access to culturally appropriate mental health care. It's also become very clear that the impact of COVID-19 financially and otherwise has also been disparate for different racial and ethnic groups. So Pew research from this month shows that the financial and job impact of COVID-19 has disproportionately affected people of color, with Hispanic and Black Americans reporting the highest percentages of job loss or pay cuts. So with all of that mental health context in mind, let's turn first to the ways that mental health concerns can impact students' participation in career development activities. Today, we're going to focus on 3 areas, 3 steps. applications, networking, and the hiring process. So first, let's explore a few ways in which mental health issues can possibly impact students' experience of completing applications for jobs and internships. Many mental illnesses, including anxiety and depression, which we discussed earlier, can make it difficult for people to sustain focus on a task, which obviously is an issue when we always want students to put in the work of tailoring their materials to each position. Difficulty concentrating is also a common side effect of some medications used to address mental illnesses. In addition to difficulties in sustaining focus, mental health issues can also make it difficult for students to start or finish applications. Mental illnesses, especially depression, may shift students into what one researcher called true neutral gear, in which initiating any activity takes an immense amount of effort. Students who experience anxiety, whether regular feelings of anxiety or diagnosed generalized anxiety disorder, may also procrastinate on beginning or completing applications, not because they're lazy, but because of feelings that they will never be chosen or that the application isn't yet perfect. Finally, depending on when they were diagnosed and what their treatment has been like, students with mental illnesses may have gaps in their work history, academic leaves of absence, or a lower GPA due to needing to take time for their health. This is not necessarily a reflection of their qualifications and abilities, but it may appear so in applications, and so it's something that we as career professionals need to be prepared for. Okay, next, let's turn to networking and the ways that students' mental health issues may impact their experience of it. So obviously, networking is a really important part of career development, but these networking events that many of us facilitate often take place in large groups, either in person or online. And even for those of us without previously identified mental health concerns, this is often not the best atmosphere for us to show up for ourselves. For students with anxiety or other disorders like PTSD, being in a large in-person group especially may be a trigger for panic, making it hard for these students to benefit from these events. And even in smaller settings or informational interviews, students with anxiety may experience negative thinking patterns about how others perceive them and have a really hard time breaking out of these patterns on their own. Networking events are also usually scheduled to take place at a specific time and place. And as previously discussed, mental illnesses, including depression, may drain students' motivation and affect their sleep cycles, making it very difficult for them to show up to events, especially those where they're expected to be on. Finally, these networking challenges for students with mental health issues may be especially exacerbated for minoritized students, including LGBTQ students, students of color, and first-generation students. Networking events are often our students' first introduction to the social and professional norms enforced in the workplace. And these norms may or may not be made explicitly clear beforehand. And even if they are, they're not created often with minoritized students' bodies, wardrobes, and experiences in mind. This knowledge of the situation increases the anxieties that these students may experience in networking situations. So finally, if we turn to interviews and the hiring process itself, there are a few ways in which mental health issues may impact students' experience. Students with anxiety, depression, or other mental illnesses may find it harder than other students to identify and articulate their professional strengths and qualifications due to negative thought patterns. They may find interviews especially challenging, given the difficulty of ever fully preparing for the questions, the near inevitability of imperfect answers, and the need to articulate one's own worth for someone else. Students who have a formal mental health diagnosis, like other students with disabilities, may also need to consider questions of disclosure in the hiring process and any clearance that they may need to undergo or background investigations. While applicants are not required to disclose a disability in the hiring process, normally they may need to do so to request accommodations in the hiring process or on the job. They may also choose to do so in order to foster a closer and more authentic relationship with their coworkers. However, students considering disclosure of a mental illness also have to weigh the possibility of stigma and implicit bias. During clearance processes and background investigations, as for federal jobs that many of our students are interested in, students may in fact be required to disclose their mental health history in order to be cleared. And finally, students with mental health issues may prioritize certain benefits that could be less important to other students you work with. And one obvious way is that these students may find it more important to know about the details of health coverage for that employer, including mental health benefits, so that they can begin or continue their treatment. These students may also be especially interested in continuing options for telework or flex work arrangements, however, and because these create opportunities for them to complete their responsibilities on a schedule, allowing for regular doctor's visits or an earlier or later schedule, depending on their sleep cycles or other adjustments as needed. And then as we look to some of the new mental health trends associated with COVID-19, by and large, they amplify some of these issues that we just identified. Students, like all of us, they may be having difficulty focusing right now when there's so much else going on in the world. Many people are experiencing shifting sleep patterns as our regular routines get sort of off from where they were before. Student surveys indicate that about half of students feel generally less prepared for their post-graduation steps as a result of COVID-19. And in addition, they have to deal with their personal life, their school life, their work life, all taking place in the same space. So it's also true that while mental health has an impact on career development, the reverse relationship also occurs, that career development activities can have an impact on our students' mental health. And while career development, of course, includes the full spectrum from exploration to negotiation, and some of these early assessment and exploration stages may actually help students to feel more in control, I want to focus today on job search activities and their impact on 3 mental health themes: isolation, loss of control, and a sense of high stakes. Okay, so if we start with this theme of isolation, career development and especially the job search, it's often a process that's oriented toward the individual instead of one that is undertaken communally or shared. Many students, therefore, they experience a sense that others are more successful or they know what they're doing, while this student, they themselves do not. And this can create a feeling of isolation that may compound the isolation of financial, personal, or legal effects of COVID-19, where students may feel that they're the only ones experiencing these issues as well. My colleague Phil Wilkerson at George Mason refers to this in the job search as seeing your own backstage and other people's front stage, a phenomenon that is only it's perfectly exemplified and exacerbated by social media. Okay, so students on the job hunt, they often also feel that they've lost control, that they've lost agency over their lives. Applying to jobs almost always comes with the experience of rejection. You're not going to get every single job you apply to. And one researcher who implemented a job search support group noted that this manifested as a lot of they-centered language that his students were using. They would say things like, "What do they want from me?" Or "When will they get back to me? How do I make them notice me?" And in all these questions and all these statements, all the control and all the agency is with the mysterious outside them, they, who are in control. Students on the job hunt may also be receiving very little information outside of a yes or a no, and sometimes not even that, sometimes just silence. And this focus on the ultimate yes or no may be part of a larger feeling that many students have, that they have no control over the outcomes, They can put in more work, they can send out more applications, they can do more informational interviews, but ultimately the outcome of their job search is beyond their control. And finally, especially in our field of international affairs, many students enter our programs with priorities like making a difference and helping others, but they may be forced by more immediate financial needs to shift their priorities to focusing on the need for income, for stability, for shelter, for insurance. And again, that's a shift that they would not have chosen and that they feel like is out of their control. Okay. And finally, students on the job hunt may feel that everything carries very high stakes and so is very high stress. This is true, obviously, of finances, as our students consider things like paying rent and other bills beyond graduation. And research shows that those job seekers with the highest level of financial hardship are also the ones who experience, on average, the highest levels of negative affect in the job search and experience it and talk about it with the most negative language. Students may experience stresses of instability in the near future, not only in their finances, but also in their housing, in their location, in their insurance coverage, and in their social lives. And in addition, students who are the first or the only in their fields, so thinking here especially about first-generation students and members of minoritized communities, they may also experience this high-stakes feeling of everything resting on them. And sometimes this comes with family or parental reinforcement. Finally, as I mentioned, many of our students entering the international relations field, they do so in order to make a difference and change the world, which is a desire that we as their institutions often reinforce because it's part of our identity as well. But this can be something that only increases the feeling of high stakes. Okay. And as we examine some of the new trends in workforce and in hiring, they align with these themes really closely. The increase in teleworking and in virtual events, job fairs, interviews may actually in some ways be helpful for accessibility and providing opportunities without crowds that people can do from home, but they can also increase isolation and place a greater burden on finances and on shared locations, since many of our students may not have an entire house or apartment to themselves. Hiring freezes and slowdowns, rescinded offers, all of these can heighten students' feelings that they have a loss of control and agency, while furloughs and layoffs can up this feeling of high stakes, make the stakes feel even higher for our students. Okay, all this stuff is really important, but I don't want to just lay out all the problems and then run off. So instead, let's explore together some strategies and resources that we can use to support our students with all of this background information in mind. So as I mentioned before, I'm a career advisor. I'm not a licensed counselor. And for those of you who are in a similar situation, you'll be happy to hear that a lot of the coaching and advising skills that you have built in your own career are applicable here. We can and we should be helping our students to build a realistic view of their industry and themselves. We can and we should empower our students with career development skills, and we can and should guide students to strategies and action plans that work for them in their own situation. And ultimately, we can and we should acknowledge the multiple challenges that our students are facing, especially right now. As career professionals, though, we are not in a place to diagnose anybody, to prescribe anything, to claim that we fully understand or to make light of anyone's experiences. And we are definitely not in a position to claim expertise we don't have. So we want to make sure that we're being very clear about some of these boundaries and ethics around our engagement with our students. So step one of supporting our students in their overall mental well-being, no matter who they are, is acknowledging mental health realities without stigma. Stigma around mental health can be a really big barrier to students seeking support of any kind. And also just logistically, it may keep them from being completely open with you, and so from receiving the resources that would be most helpful. So first, we all need to get used to mentioning mental health, to discussing it comfortably, and to making referrals if needed. We need to know what resources are available on and off campus, and we need to familiarize ourselves with the basics of the Americans with Disabilities Act, the ADA, and some common accommodations should our students want to discuss these options. We don't need to become experts. We should not claim to be experts, but a baseline familiarity with these topics is really key. Finally, in our work with students, we should consider some of the intersections that we outlined today between mental health and other identities or other areas of life. It's also important for us to support our students from a place of strength. If I've learned one thing from running in mental health advocacy circles and interacting with students and coworkers and mentors who have experienced mental health issues, it's that if a person is enrolled in school or in the workplace and is continuing to move forward personally and academically, professionally, while dealing with mental health issues, they are already being very strong and resourceful. And we should explicitly recognize these students' self-advocacy, resilience, and the community or cultural resources that they're drawing on, rather than coming from a deficit mindset. We can use this recognition to help our students identify previously successful strategies that have served them well in similar situations before. So most of our students have probably not interviewed for jobs virtually during a global pandemic, but they have probably dealt with disruptions to their schedules or with other stressful situations or with isolation. And the ways in which they succeeded in these situations before may be helpful in helping them to identify strategies for succeeding now. And we can play a really important role in helping them draw these connections and identify these strategies. Finally, we can help our students to create concrete, realistic plans for their continued career development, recognizing that all of our students are different and that each student is an expert on themselves and their own situation. For example, some students who are struggling with motivation, they may benefit from having a clear timeline with set goals, but other students may find that that level of structure increases their anxiety about failure or about not completing things on time. So this really needs to be helping students to come up with tailored approaches that are nonetheless uniformly a high quality of support. The final element that I wanted to identify for you today is supporting our students' mental health and career development through community. We can work to create opportunities for peer-to-peer exchange and support, either by referring students to existing organizations like Mental Health America and Active Minds both have strong peer-to-peer advising and support, or by creating new opportunities. Our office at the School of International Service at AU has run a job search support group for the last few years in the spring, which brings together job searching grad students to provide community and accountability and support to one another. And this summer, we are also holding a series of student forums to allow students to connect over their job search frustrations and share resources with one another. And if we have any time during Q&A, I would love to hear about some of the other ideas that maybe you've implemented in the past or that you're implementing now to try and build some of this sense of community. It's also important to connect students with community-specific resources and to help them plan to do so after graduation. While they're still a part of the campus community, this might include things like student unions or clubs. And before or after graduation, it might include referring them to professional associations that are community-specific, especially those designed to support minoritized communities that face some of these additional stressors and taxes on mental health that I discussed earlier. In our industry, sometimes for me, this has looked like connecting with groups like WCAPS, Women of Color Advancing Peace and Security, with Black professionals in international affairs, OUT in national security, Women in International Security, and Women's Action for New Directions has the En Voz Alta program for supporting emerging Latinx professionals. Access to these communities and the support can really help to alleviate some of the stressors that I spoke about earlier of being the first or the only in your workplace or in your community. And finally, we can practice self-disclosure as we're comfortable in order to build trust and establish ourselves as safe spaces for our students to be vulnerable. Again, thinking about the boundaries of professionalism and ethics as we do so. This might look like just simply admitting to students that you're a little stressed and tired because of the quarantine, or it might look like sharing your own experience of managing anxiety or panic attacks in the workplace in order to let them know that this is something that not only there's no stigma around, but also something that people they look up to and respect have done. Okay, and as we wrap up, I know I talked a lot about getting informed and getting comfortable with these topics, getting trained. So here are some ways to do so. And I believe Carmen's going to make these slides available afterward, so you don't have to write it all down right now. So as we look at some of these ways to learn more, the Steve Fund focuses on supporting the mental health and well-being of students of color. The Trevor Project supports LGBTQ youth mental health. United We Dream has the UndocuHealth program, which provides resources and information about mental health for undocumented students. The Judd Foundation partners with high schools and universities to promote young adult mental health and counter suicide. Active Minds is a nationwide student organization countering stigma around mental health, and Mental Health America is a broader organization that also includes some really great student peer-to-peer services. As you're thinking about maybe brushing up on the ADA and accommodations, you can look at JAN, the Job Accommodations Network, and EARN, which are two great resources for this area. In terms of formal training, it's likely that your on-campus counseling center provides options or will if you ask. You can also explore the certification through Mental Health First Aid, which I highly recommend, but it is a little bit more of a commitment. It's, I think, 1 or 2 days of formal training from a trainer. There are also a lot of free trainings online. So right now, the American Red Cross has an online training that's free, specifically on supporting psychosocial health for yourself and others during COVID-19. The Veterans Administration, the VA, and PsychArmor Institute worked together to provide free online courses through SAVE on veteran mental health and working with veterans, which has been helpful for me since we do have a pretty large military and veteran student population. And ACPA had a really great webinar series on international students and mental health, I think back in the fall, and you can still access that for free online. Okay. So I know we covered a whole lot of ground just now, and like I said, the slides are going to be made available later on. I can also share my speaker notes if there was anything there that you wanted to look at later on. But I do want to make sure that we have some time for Q&A, for discussion. So if you have any questions about things that I covered today, you can enter them into the chat box and Carmen can help out with that. Again, like with all of those professional boundaries and caveats, ethics stuff, that I am not a counselor, I'm just a career advisor who cares about this a lot.
Well, thank you, Elise, for how much you do care and for that wonderful presentation. While folks are typing, since my mic works, I always get the privilege of the first question. And I want to go back to what you mentioned about how our students are often ones who want to really take on big challenges. And not that they're insurmountable, but something like global poverty or the climate crisis is much bigger than any one of us on our own can do. Are there strategies you've found for talking with students about their role in these big issues, or how you help a student who already feels perhaps more helpless or less like they have less agency deal with these things in which we all have limited agency?
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. I think in some ways, with the students that I work with, this is often a process that they go through in like the first year of their program, where many of them do come in with these really huge dreams, and they tend to stay there but become more tailored throughout the course of their program. And so I think this is one point in which the work that we already do in promoting students' knowledge of like the industries that they want to go into and the different career paths and possibilities there, helping them to have a realistic idea of what it means to work in countering global poverty. What does that mean for that to be a job as well as a calling? What does that look like day to day can really be helpful in helping students to have a more realistic idea, because I think for those whose ideas may be less realistic about the total impact that they can have, that reflects like greater stress in terms of the high stakes, and then also maybe greater possibilities of feelings of failure if they're not becoming a UN diplomat within 6 months. So I think a lot of this really is just sort of raising awareness among our students of what the possibilities are without like actively crushing their dreams.
I like that way to phrase it. It's both a job and a calling, and you can have the calling even if the job is not in 6 months.
One related
Please.
conversation that we've been having with our students, especially this summer in the age of COVID-19, is thinking about the ways in which those goals might shift now. So if somebody came into the program really dedicated to working on global poverty, whether there are ways that they can meet their shorter term needs for stability, for finances, for housing and insurance by doing that kind of work, but maybe doing it domestically to start building their track record and to be working on these same issues, but maybe in a different setting than they had originally imagined, and helping them to see that like it's okay to make that shift for the setting.
So our first question is an interest to learn more about the job search support group and the student fora that you have planned for the summer. Can you share more details on that?
Yeah, so the job search support group is a program that I've been running the last 2 years, and it was based on conversations I had with other career professionals who were running. Originally, the model was job search work groups and some online sort of career boot camps that other people were running. And the idea here was that even in normal times, the job search can be a really isolating process. And for many of the students who participated in the program the first year, like they thought the readings I shared were interesting and some of the skills that I shared with them were helpful, but really most of the enthusiasm was like, I realized it wasn't just me, and I realized I wasn't crazy. And so just being able to have that affirmation from somebody who's not a career advisor, because they listen to me certainly, but like hearing this from somebody else who's a peer often makes a bigger impact of hearing that like they're not the only one who has submitted 50 applications and hasn't heard back from anybody, or like they're not crazy, there really just aren't that many jobs in this industry right now. So when I thought about the program this year, that's something that I really tried to hone in on, is giving this semi-structured space for students to interact around their job search and to support each other, because I think I also heard from students that they benefited from having a little bit more of that feeling of agency, and that they could support other students and not just be feeling like they were always the one who were in need and looking for help. The fora that we've been running this summer, were a new program that were in response to COVID-19. And I had already wrapped up the job search support group for the spring semester. And so in some ways, this was trying to create that same sort of space, but on a shorter term basis, because the job search support group was 4 meetings across 2 months. And this was just like a couple of 1-hour sessions, so far once a month, where we, for the first one, really just wanted to provide students with a space to get all their feels out first about like, they are anxious, they are worried. I did a word cloud like I tried to do on this presentation with the students, and I said 3 words to describe your job search, and like anxious and uncertain and scared were all the biggest ones. And the most positive one was a tiny little word in the corner that said semi-optimistic. Like that was the best we got. But we heard from students afterward that just having this space to like be open about their experience of this time and to wind up with some specific next steps helped them first to get some of those feelings out and feel like they were heard and acknowledged, but then also to be able to move forward in their job search, even with all of this isolation and uncertainty and lack of control acknowledged. None of that changed, but being able to feel like that was noticed and still be able to move forward was important for them.
Great, thank you. One of our colleagues says they're having trouble getting the job seekers to be involved or responsive. We assume they're in a bit of a state of shock, but are there things that can be done to get them engaged again that are respectful of kind of that spectrum that you talked about?
Yeah, I think one thing that was really helpful for us as we thought about our programming was hearing from students, those that we were still sort of in contact with, that many of them, especially like a month or so ago when everything was just such chaos, that often they didn't have coherent questions. It wasn't like they knew to say, I need a resume review or which company should I be looking at? It was just sort of, again, this feeling of like, everything is on fire, and that's not a question. And so for a lot of our students, they felt like there wasn't anything to bring to us if there wasn't anything specific that they could tell us or ask us. And so I think as we approached some of the programming that we were doing, we tried to be very conscious of creating spaces where students who only had the still could bring that and express that without any expectation that they would come in with something clearly articulated and say like, here are my next steps, how do I do it? Because that sort of planning and proactivity, I think, did certainly take a back seat when like there's a global pandemic. And so providing that space, and that's also something that I've tried to do in our messaging to students through emails and LinkedIn and so on since then, saying like, if you come for drop-ins, you don't need to have a specific question. You can just have like general worry and concern, and we can work with that. Like that is doable. Or like, if you come to this event, you don't have to have specific questions. You don't have to have specific goals. You don't have to look good. You don't have to use the camera on Zoom, because I think that is sometimes also an additional stressor for our students when we have a lot of these online events, is that for many of them, they may be in new locations where they don't have much control over what's going on around them. They may not have a nice background to use. Their hair may not look good. They may not have like showered or gotten new clothes in a while. And so as much as possible, we've been trying to like be explicit about taking those expectations off the table.
I think that's great. The proactive, like, come with your panic and we'll get to the questions later approach. One of our colleagues asks, what about behavioral issues on the job? It could be ASD related, but not only. Can students get training on how to behave that will maximize their professional success, particularly if talking about it can be such a sensitive topic?
Yeah, I know there are some really great programs both on the university side and on the employer side around neurodiversity and hiring initiatives, internship programs. And that's not an area that I've been as involved in. But I know, for example, again, George Mason has a really good program around this, and a lot of employers are looking to try to ramp up their hiring among neurodiverse populations, because while these may be ways that employers are not used to interacting with applicants or with people on the job, again, coming from this position of a strength-based approach, people who are on the spectrum have lots of other strengths that applicants who aren't on the spectrum may not. So I think on our side, again, this is a question of like being able to articulate that this is not a deficit per se. This is something where like people have their own strengths, and they must have been finding ways to like get through their internships and get through their classes and other professional interactions. So talking about how have you been doing that previously, what might be applicable here, like when you want to stim, but you're in a professional setting and you can't be like spinning in circles, what have you done that has worked for you otherwise? Like, do you have a squeezy ball? Do you have a fidget spinner that you put under the table? And if this is sort of a broader problem and something where the student may or may not have a formal diagnosis or may not have disclosed that to you, you can still help them to think about, like, as you move forward into the workforce, what might be some of the things that are challenging for you, and how can you plan now to deal with those moving forward. And hopefully you can also find some resources that are specific to this question and to the student you're working with. But ultimately, I think the other part of this is remembering that we, again, are not in a position to make diagnoses. We are just in a position to work with the information that students give us and help them to identify and overcome the challenges that they are seeing in their career development.
I see some folks typing, so I'll buy you some time.
Okay.
A lot of the approach, at least that you articulate so well, relies on such a personal relationship with the student, building their trust, getting them to know you, and feeling comfortable sharing with you whether they have been diagnosed or just having a really difficult time in this very unusual moment. Have you, as you think about reaching students on a more mass scale, particularly for our colleagues who are one against many, when they think about their student, not against,
Yep.
with many. Okay. Are there strategies, you talked a little bit about just working it into your general messaging, that can be used in a broader context to build trust or to signal that these things are okay when you can't go one by one with students?
Yeah, I think one good strategy here is, like you mentioned, thinking about the messaging you're already doing and how you can embed some of these things in your messaging, the same as you might do around other topics relating to like diversity, equity, and inclusion. So just like you may think about in your newsletters, what do the people look like that you're using for stock images? You might also think about when you look at the language you're using, if somebody is experiencing mental health issues and they like are exhausted and haven't slept in 3 days and can't get themselves motivated, how is your language going to come across? Is it going to come across as like professional and motivating and understanding, or is it going to come across as like, we don't need you, we don't want you to be coming in unless you've got your stuff together? The other thing that we can be thinking about, and this may be in some ways more of a visual technique, so thinking about like once we're back in person, or the video communication that we have, is thinking about how we communicate that. So maybe learning some lessons from things like safe space training around LGBTQ issues, or some of the initiatives around like safe spaces for veteran students or for undocumented students. A lot of times this involves like having a little sticker or thinking about what else in your office or in your video space indicates that you are a safe person to talk to about these things, even if you haven't ever interacted with the student before.
That's great. Everyone can build their Zoom screen with all of their signals that they're a great resource. So with the time we have left, we have one more. I'm sorry. What?
Oh, I said, or if you're one of those people who has like a bookshelf behind you, think about what books are on there.
Absolutely. The New York Times has dedicated lots of real estate to analyzing celebrities' book choices, so you can do the same. So one more question with the time we have. Sometimes in the mental health community, advocates use the term illness rather than health for parity. Are there techniques that apply to more severe psychological manifestations of illness that rather than different behavior, that differ from behavioral, excuse me?
I'm going to ask for clarification on that question.
While they type, I think I read it poorly. So are there techniques that are different, whether it's a behavioral challenge compared to a psychosociological or a psychosocial situation? They're typing. It's okay. I mean, do you use different strategies, whether the student you're approaching has been diagnosed with depression or anxiety compared to something that manifests itself more physiologically, more behaviorally?
Okay. So I think part of this for me, again, is having a clear sense of my own boundaries as a professional and my ethics. I don't think that for me there are very different ways in which I approach these things. Okay, so I see the chat box thinking about things like bipolar schizophrenia, because in the way that I approach these questions, it's still a matter of like getting your background reading done and sort of having a baseline idea of what this might mean, and then supporting students in the issues that they identify or helping them to identify the issues that may come up. And I think in this way, when it is very much a student-directed process, it's not something where I feel the need to do as much like dividing between different manifestations. I don't know if that's directly responding to the question, but if not, feel free to email me later and we can talk offline.
You got a yes, thanks with an exclamation point. So well done.
Okay.
Well done overall, Elise. Thank you so much. This has been such a great introduction and way to reshape our thinking about how we think about these questions and how we think about students. So thank you so much for putting this presentation together. As Elise mentioned, the slides will be available. The recording will be available afterwards. We look forward to seeing all of you at many future manifestations of our in-person meeting, and hopefully at some point soon with actual human contact. Thank you again to Elise for all of your good work on this topic and on this webinar. Thanks to all of our guests for joining us, and I look forward to seeing you at other upcoming APSIA events. Take care, everyone, and stay safe.